Let's start with the only question that matters in advertising. What are you actually selling? Not the tone or not the joke, the product. Strip away every aesthetic decision and ask what is left, because what is left is the only thing that the market actually prices. Here's the rule, and it's not going to be complicated. An insult is a distribution mechanism, not a product. It moves attention, it does not create value. Whether an ad succeeds or fails has nothing to do with whether it was mean, and everything to do with whether there was a differentiated product sitting behind the attention once it arrived. Insult arrival with nothing behind it, you have just spent capital, reputational capital, audience goodwill, the finite trust of strangers, on a transaction that returns nothing. That is not a marketing failure. That is a balance sheet failure dressed up as a creative decision. We're going to run through two cases, the same mechanism, yet they have opposite returns. It's January, year of our Lord 1984. 60 seconds of airtime during the single most expensive media buy in American advertising, the Super Bowl. There is no price point shown in the ad, there is no feature list, there are no specs. It is just IBM cast as a faceless authoritarian apparatus and a single act of rebellion against it. This advertisement, Apple's 1984, is remembered as the best advertisement ever produced. A won the Grand Prix at Cannes, advertising age, commercial of the decade, $5 million in earned media in 24 hours because every news outlet replayed it for free multiple times. We're going to forget the imagery for a second here and run the transaction. Apple spent reputational capital attacking IBM's image, conformity, control, the gray monoculture of corporate computing, and in exchange, the audience received a real asset, the Macintosh, a genuinely differentiated product. It had a graphical interface. It had mouse-driven operation. Nothing else in the consumer market looked like it. The insult was not the payload of the ad, it was simply the delivery mechanism for the payload that was the Macintosh. This is the whole model of value-positive advertising in one sentence. Spend attention capital attacking a competitor's position and immediately convert that attention into a demonstration of differentiated value. The audience leaves the transaction with something. That is why it worked. Not just because it was clever or topical considering the year it was made, but because it cleared the margin. Because now we are going to run the counter case. Apple themselves ran the counter case a year later with the same target, lemmings, blindfolded executives marching off a cliff. The implied accusation is that if you bought IBM, you're a sheep. The same rival in the same media slot, the Super Bowl in 1985, from the same company. This was a total non-event. There was no award sweep, there was no earned media. Steve Jobs reportedly hated it before it even aired, and he was right to. Why is there such a difference? Because this time, the target of the insult was the audience itself. The people Apple needed to convert were the ones being mocked, and there was no asset handed back to them once the joke landed. Pure capital expenditure with zero return. The product didn't matter here because the product was never the subject. The insult was standalone, and a standalone insult is a cost center, not an actual campaign of marketing. Write this rule down. An insult only generates a return when it's structurally tied to a demonstration of differentiated product. Remove the differentiated product, and the exact same rhetorical move, punching at a rival, even the same rival, produces nothing. The mechanism is neutral. What actually prices it in is a differentiation. We're traveling 41 years into the future. It's June of 2026. Indie animator Robert Paligiero releases a Kickstarter promo for a pilot called Chimptopia, styled after Tex Avery and Looney Tunes era cartoons. The trailer contains a direct parody jab at another indie animated project, Gamoverse, produced by Glitch Productions. 11 million views in roughly 48 hours. Looks, on the surface, like the same transaction that Apple ran. It is not. We are going to find out why, line by line, like we would audit any product launch that burned capital and produced a liability instead of an asset. And here's the thing, guys. This isn't really a Kickstarter pitch. This is a startup pitch deck wearing a cartoon mascot costume. It's the same structure, the same tells, the same language. Compare yourself to category leaders you haven't earned the comparison to. Claim a category is broken or underserved without defining the category. Ask for capital in escalating tranches gated behind milestones instead of one honest number. This is the exact playbook of every We're the Uber of X deck that has ever gotten laughed out of a room, except in tech, there is usually a VC on the other side of the table who has seen 1,000 of these and can price the bullshit out internally. Kickstarter has no underwriter. There is no analyst in the room. The retail backer is the only diligence this pitch will ever face, and retail backers are exactly the audience least equipped to price check a comp set. That's simply the business model. So, we're going to review the product. 3 20-something men behind on rent working to avoid eviction from a landlord. This is the entire premise. There is no further differentiation offered anywhere in the pitch material. This is not a niche premise that simply failed to land. It's one of the most saturated premises in the entire comedy market. Workaholics, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Trailer Park Boys, Clerks. Multiple successful, long-running properties already occupy this exact positioning. Launching into a saturated category with zero stated differentiation is not a creative choice, it's a market entry failure. You don't get to skip the differentiation step and substitute marketing aggression instead. That is not that is not a strategy. Apologies. That is an attempt to manufacture scarcity in a category that has none. The pitch states that the show blends the relatability of Seinfeld, the crudeness of South Park, and the wackiness of Smiling Friends into something unique. This is the exact move every mediocre startup deck makes in the competitive landscape slide. You don't say, we have no real comparable and that's a risk. You say, we're like Stripe. We're like Uber. We're like Amazon, but for X. You invoke 3 category leaders. You claim that the intersection of all 3 is uniquely yours, and you hope that nobody in the room actually pressure tests the comparison. It works on retail backers for the same reason it works on naive angel investors. The names carry weight that the underlying claim hasn't actually earned. We're going to treat this as a comparables analysis because that's functionally what it is, citing established properties to justify evaluation. The problem here is that each comp gets reduced to a single adjective, and a single adjective is not a comparison. Seinfeld's actual mechanism is treating zero-stakes minutiae as the entire engine of the plot. South Park's mechanism of crudeness is extreme topicality. They made an episode 5 days after the political event actually happened. You cannot get that speed in any other form of animation ever. Smiling Friends' mechanism is tonal arbitrage. Sincere material immediately juxtaposed against grotesque non-sequitur, sometimes within a very short amount of time from each other. None of that is in the pitch. What is in the pitch is 3 adjectives that could apply to half of the comedy catalog ever produced. That is not a comp set. That is name-dropping collateral you don't actually own to borrow valuation that you have not actually earned. If you have stripped the brand names out of that sentence, there is no claim left standing. Exactly like stripping out Uber for X out of a deck and asking what's actually left underneath. This was not a flat ask. It was a stretch goal ladder. $50,000 unlocks episode 2, $100,000 character figurines, $150,000 episode 3, $200,000 a musical sequence, and $500,000 just to reach episode 4. We're going to run that as a financing structure, not as a fan engagement gimmick, because it is actually a financing structure. You, my friend, are asking unsecured retail backers, strangers essentially, pre-revenue, no equity, no guaranteed delivery, to fund up $500,000 of speculative production from a first-time creator on a premise with zero stated differentiation before a single dollar of institutional capital, pre-sale revenue, or distribution commitment exists. That is an extremely high cost of capital being rated against extremely low collateral. No serious investor underwrites that risk profile without differentiation to justify it. You're asking retail backers to underwrite it anyway off the strength of a marketing stunt. The pitch also claims that indie animation suffers from a severe lack of episodic shows. We're going to audit that claim the same way you would audit "the industry is broken and we're here to disrupt it" slide in any deck by checking the definition of the market being cited. Every weak startup pitch needs a villain, a stagnant, underserved, broken industry that's just been waiting for the founder to show up and fix it. The bigger and more authoritative the claimed market, the more legitimate the disruption narrative sounds. Which is exactly why nobody scoping these claims ever defines the market honestly. A defined market is a falsifiable market. If indie animation means the actual global category, Ralph Bakshi's independently produced studio system rejecting work going back to the 70s, Marcel spending 23 years self-financing 15 different animation styles into a single feature, a 5-year independently produced Chilean stop-motion product that won recognition on Cannes, an autobiographical animated feature out of Iran by way of France, a Belgian stop-motion film made from 1,500 plastic toys that became the first stop-motion feature ever selected for Cannes competition, etc., etc., then the claim is simply false. That market has never been short on output, format, or ambition. What is actually being cited is a market of 2 or 3 web series that the pitch author happens to be aware of, dressed in the language of an entire global industry to make the claim sound bigger than it is. That is not market analysis. That is a sample size of 2 being presented as an industry trend because the real, scoped claim wasn't impressive enough to lead with. We have a generic, undifferentiated core product. A comp set borrowed without the underlying mechanism that gives the comps their value. A capital structure that asks unsecured retail backers to absorb risk that no institutional capital would touch at that price. A market size claim that collapses under definition. We're going to strip away the cartoon mascot, and what you're left with is a deck. The same deck every bad startup has run for a decade. Borrow the comps, claim the broken industry, gate the capital behind milestones, skip the part where you actually explain what makes the actual product different from the 10 things already occupying its category. The only difference between Chimptopia and a SaaS founder with a logo and a Canva deck is that Chimptopia got to skip the boardroom. No VC ever sat across the table and asked the obvious question, what's actually different here? Because there was no table. Just a comment section, and by the time anybody had already started asking, the trailer had already done its damage. The Game vs. Jab wasn't a standalone misstep sitting on top of a sound operation. It was the only asset that this campaign, this pitch, actually had. Attention borrowed from somebody else's audience, because there was no differentiated product capable of generating attention on its own. Every layer of this campaign runs the identical operation. Claim value you haven't built, and hope nobody checks the underlying asset. Apple's 1984 campaign spent reputational capital and converted it into demonstrated product differentiation. That is a value-positive transaction. Capital out, asset in. Chimptopia spent reputational capital it never had against a target that could and unintentionally mobilize against it with no differentiated products to convert that attention to. That is not advertising. That is a pitch deck with no underwriter, run on an audience that never got the chance to say no before the capital started moving. The lesson isn't, don't punch at your rivals. Punch all you want, ladies and gentlemen. That is not where the risk lives. The risk lives in punching without an asset behind the punch. The moment the insult is the entire balance sheet of your operation, you're not running a campaign. You are running a deficit, and eventually you're going to have to pay it up. This is The Art Economist. I'll see you guys next time. Apologies for the outspoken tone in this video, and peace out.